listen to me very carefully. Last year, we changed the law to remove taxes on materials for packaging of tea. We did that in the last year's budget. That we begin the branding of our tea. We begin the packaging of our tea. We cannot continue to export our tea in sacks.
Kenya's exports to the United Kingdom are on the decline, with the value of exports to the key market falling by 20% between 2009 and 2016 to close off the period with a valuation of 44 billion shillings. This according to the just released UK-Kenya Trade and Investment Relations report. Research Director for the UK Department for International Development, Doug Wellham, says the drop is as a result of a lack of diversification in a matter which has seen the country's export product take a slump in terms of its competitive edge.
To visit Kenya and seek the chance for the tea and coffee investment in Kenya.
Britain thought tea was untouchable, a symbol, a certainty, a tradition no one would ever dare disrupt. But while the United Kingdom clung to history, Kenya and China were rewriting the future. Quietly, contracts shifted. Value moved closer to the source. British buyers stopped setting prices and started competing for supply. And by the time Britain realized what was happening, its tea industry was already collapsing from the inside. This wasn't a trade war.
And to matters agriculture, where Cabinet Secretary for Agriculture, Mutahi Kagwe, says upcoming policy reforms in the tea sector will allow all the 142 tea factories in the country to eliminate middlemen and sell directly to international buyers. The move is expected to significantly boost profit margins for tea farmers by increasing transparency in the supply chain.
It was something far worse. It was irrelevance. Kenya proved it no longer needed Britain to succeed. China proved global markets could be rebuilt without British control, and the industry Britain once dominated was dismantled without a single confrontation. The question now isn't whether Britain lost its grip. It's how many other industries will fall next.
But it is time we ourselves take the advantage of our good quality tea and brand it, and anybody else who wants to use our good quality tea must come and work with us.
For generations, the United Kingdom treated tea not just as a commodity, but as a symbol of continuity. It was woven into daily rituals, national identity, and global trade networks that once stretched unchallenged across continents. Yet symbols, no matter how deeply rooted, are only as strong as the systems that sustain them. And when Kenya and China quietly realigned their strategies, that system began to fracture faster than Britain ever imagined. The shift did not begin with confrontation. It began with coordination. Kenya, long one of the world's most productive tea exporters, had grown increasingly aware of an uncomfortable imbalance. The United Kingdom continued to dominate branding, pricing influence, and downstream profits, while Kenya absorbed climate risk, labor volatility, and infrastructure strain. For years, this arrangement was tolerated under the assumption that tradition guaranteed stability, but tradition does not pay farmers. China entered the picture, not as a disruptor, but as an enabler. With vast experience in commodity processing, branding, and global distribution, China saw what Kenya saw. Value was being extracted far from the source. Together, they asked a question Britain never expected to hear aloud: why should the producer remain invisible? Kenya began upgrading processing capacity. New facilities appeared near growing regions. Quality control shifted closer to the source. Packaging, branding, and certification no longer defaulted to foreign firms. At the same time, China offered logistics integration, access to alternative markets, and financial backing insulated from British institutions. The result was subtle at first. British import volumes dipped slightly, contracts were renegotiated, delivery timelines changed. The United Kingdom dismissed the signals as temporary market noise, but markets rarely whisper without reason. China helped Kenya reposition tea not as a raw export, but as a finished product. Branded Kenyan tea entered Asian markets under its own identity. Prices reflected quality rather than legacy. Margins stayed closer to origin. For the first time, Kenya was selling tea without Britain in the middle. This is where humiliation began, not in headlines, but in spreadsheets. British tea firms discovered that their leverage had weakened. Kenyan suppliers were no longer desperate for access to British shelves. Chinese-backed distribution offered alternatives. Negotiations stalled. Britain could not dictate terms it no longer controlled. The United Kingdom responded with assumptions rather than strategy. It believed consumers would remain loyal. It believed historical preference would override supply shifts. It believed Kenya would eventually return to familiar arrangements. Kenya did not. As Kenyan exports diversified, Britain's tea industry felt pressure across the entire chain. Processing plants reliant on Kenyan leaf operated below capacity. Blending operations lost consistency. Costs rose as alternative suppliers failed to match Kenyan volume and quality. China's role intensified the disruption. Chinese firms began integrating Kenyan tea into global e-commerce platforms, bypassing traditional British wholesalers entirely. Consumers in regions Britain had once dominated now encountered Kenyan tea without British branding. The story changed. The origin mattered. The narrative shifted. Britain had underestimated the power of origin storytelling. As demand for Kenyan-branded tea grew elsewhere, availability for British firms tightened. Prices increased, margins shrank, retailers raised prices cautiously, only to face declining sales. Tea, once a staple immune to volatility, became a casualty of strategic miscalculation. The collapse was not sudden, it was progressive. British growers, already marginal players in global tea production, could not compensate. Domestic cultivation lacked scale. Import substitution failed. The industry's dependence on historical trade routes left it exposed. Kenya and China did not need to attack Britain. They simply outgrew it. The humiliation deepened when Britain attempted to reassert influence through trade diplomacy. Kenya listened politely but remained firm. China continued offering infrastructure investment, market access, and technological support without demanding symbolic concessions. Britain offered familiarity. Kenya chose opportunity. Tea auctions once centered on British buyers now saw reduced participation. Kenyan sellers diversified clientele. China facilitated connections to markets Britain had never prioritized. The gravitational center shifted. British analysts struggled to explain the speed of decline. They blamed global inflation, changing tastes, even weather. Rarely did they acknowledge the core issue Britain no longer controlled: the value chain. The tea industry's collapse exposed a larger truth about Britain's economic posture. Legacy industries survive only when they evolve. Britain had relied on history to substitute for strategy. Kenya and China relied on coordination. For Kenya, the shift was about dignity and development. Keeping value at home meant higher incomes, better infrastructure, and economic resilience. For China, it was about securing reliable supply chains and strengthening influence through partnership rather than dominance. For Britain, it was a shock. Tea imports continued, but under less favorable terms. British brands lost exclusivity, shelf space shrank, consumers noticed price increases and inconsistent quality. The ritual remained, but the certainty vanished. The humiliation was not public mockery. It was something worse: irrelevance. Kenya had proven it could thrive without Britain's approval. China had proven it could reshape markets quietly, and Britain had proven that nostalgia was not a business model. The collapse of Britain's tea industry was not just about leaves and cups. It was about power, perception, and the cost of assuming the world would never change. As Kenya and China moved forward, Britain was left confronting an uncomfortable reality. The empire of influence it once enjoyed could dissolve without a single confrontation, simply by being bypassed, and this was only the beginning. As the consequences of Kenya and China's realignment deepened, the United Kingdom's tea sector entered a phase of visible distress. What had once been treated as a stable, low-risk industry now showed signs of systemic weakness. Warehouses held uneven stock, supply contracts lacked certainty, long-term planning became impossible. British firms attempted diversification, sourcing from other producing countries. The results were mixed. Some alternatives lacked scale, others faced political or climate instability. None matched Kenya's balance of volume, quality, and logistical reliability. The cost of substitution exceeded expectations, squeezing margins already under pressure. Kenya understood this vulnerability and adjusted its approach carefully. It did not cut off Britain completely. Instead, it reduced dependence, limited supply, maintained leverage, while expanded global access ensured stability. China reinforced this strategy by offering financing mechanisms that reduced Kenya's exposure to currency fluctuations tied to British markets. This balance proved decisive. British buyers now competed with global demand rather than commanding it. Auctions reflected this shift. Prices no longer moved predictably. The United Kingdom lost its role as price setter and became a price taker. The humiliation extended beyond economics into cultural influence. For decades, Britain's identity had been entwined with tea culture. Yet as Kenyan-branded tea gained international recognition, Britain's narrative dominance eroded. Tea was no longer associated solely with British refinement or heritage. It became associated with origin, sustainability, and producer empowerment. Kenya controlled that narrative. China amplified it through global media channels and retail platforms. The story resonated with younger consumers who valued transparency over tradition. British brands struggled to adapt. Rebranding efforts felt reactive rather than authentic. The British government attempted intervention. Trade missions were dispatched, incentives were discussed, but fiscal constraints limited options. Britain could not subsidize its way out of structural dependence. Kenya's advantage was rooted in production reality, not policy rhetoric. China's role continued evolving. Beyond trade, China invested in research and processing innovation in Kenya. New blends, specialty products, and packaging formats expanded market reach. This innovation cycle kept Kenyan tea competitive while British firms remained focused on preserving existing models. The contrast was stark. Kenya reinvested gains into rural development, logistics, and farmer support. Productivity improved, quality stabilized. Britain, facing declining revenue, cut costs, investment slowed. The gap widened. British retailers faced consumer backlash as prices rose. Tea, once affordable and consistent, became another product subject to volatility. Consumer loyalty weakened, substitutes gained ground. Coffee, herbal infusions, and alternative beverages filled the gap. The tea industry's decline rippled outward. Shipping companies adjusted routes, warehousing demand dropped, employment contracted. Regions historically tied to tea processing felt the strain. What began as a trade shift became a domestic economic issue. Kenya observed these developments without triumphalism. The objective was never Britain's decline, it was autonomy. China, similarly, focused on stability rather than spectacle. Yet the outcome was unavoidable. Britain had misread the balance of power. It assumed access was guaranteed. It assumed producers would accept subordinate roles indefinitely. Kenya and China demonstrated that partnership without hierarchy could outcompete legacy dominance. The lesson extended beyond tea. Other commodities followed similar patterns. Britain's reliance on historical relationships faced scrutiny across sectors. Kenya's success became a reference point for other producers seeking greater control over value chains. The United Kingdom found itself responding rather than leading. Attempts to negotiate new frameworks came late. Trust had shifted. Kenya preferred diversified partnerships. China's presence ensured continuity. Britain's offers lacked urgency and scale. Tea remained in British homes, but its origin story had changed. The comfort of familiarity was gone. Each cup reminded consumers of a global economy no longer centered on British preferences. The collapse was not total, but it was decisive. Britain's tea industry would survive, but as a smaller, less influential player. The era of dominance had ended quietly, without confrontation or ceremony. Kenya had proven that strategic patience could dismantle dependency. China had proven that influence could be built through alignment rather than control. Britain had learned too late that industries built on tradition alone are vulnerable to partners who choose progress. And as the global market adjusted, one truth became clear. Humiliation in the modern economy does not come from defeat. It comes from being outgrown.